Today's scripture reading will be taken from Matthew 7:24 through 27. 24 through 27. Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man which built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house. And it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. And every one that heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them not, shall be likened unto a foolish man which built his house upon the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it.
Evening, everybody. Ty did this little light of mine, so I'm going to do the wise man and foolish man. Thank you all for your attendance. There's a little bit bigger number than I expected tonight, and no one deserves to be punished for coming to Sunday night services. They won't keep you here terribly long. I'm sure a lot of people have plans for after services, so I'll try to keep this relatively concise. As far as sermons go around this time of the year, a lot of times there's sermons about New Year's resolutions, and this really isn't going to be one of those, maybe more of a New Year's reflection sermon, but wouldn't be a very good doctor if I said New Year's resolutions are a bad thing. 1 Timothy chapter 4 and 6 says, in the pointing out of these things to the brethren, you'll be a good servant of Christ Jesus, constantly nourished of the words of the faith of the sound doctrine of which you've been following, but have nothing to do with the worldly fables that fit only for old women. On the other hand, discipline yourself for the purpose of godliness, for bodily discipline is only of little profit. It's one we like to quote a lot. We say that studying the Bible is obviously a lot more important than physical exercise. But if I stood up here and said it's not important to get your A1C down or lose a few pounds or do better in the next year than it was in the last, then like I said, I'd be a pretty bad doctor. So those things are important. New Year's resolutions are important. Getting yourself in shape is important. But just as importantly, I think every sermon that you hear or every week should be a New Year's resolution. You know, every time you set yourself forward to progress as a Christian, as we say, every time, you know, I'm just as guilty as anyone else. One of the more common things we say in our prayers is that we might be better Christians in the future when we leave here than we were when we came here. Well, that in of itself should be a turning point of a resolution to be that better Christian or to make this change or that change. So the flip of December to January is really important, but just as important, I think every time we leave this building should be a resolution to be that better Christian. So again, tonight I'm going to talk more about reflection than a resolution. And that reflection is going to be along the lines of where are you planted? Where is your house built? And where are your beliefs affirmed? What are the pillars that hold your Christianity up? Your Christianity is a little house or a little castle or a little fort, depending on how resolute your Christianity is. If you're early in your faith, if you've just been baptized, you're probably living in this little tiny shack, and it's probably not built on much. Where you built it is different for everybody, but you've not been doing this for very long, so the walls aren't very thick. You haven't had time to build this castle around you, so you're living in your little shack. If you've been a Christian for, I don't know, 70, 80, 90 years for some of us perhaps, then you might be living more in the Windsor Castle. You've spent a long time building the walls of your castle, of the Christianity that you've built around yourself. And so that's well and good, and that's all important. And like I said, everybody's at different stages, and that's not what this is about. Otherwise, it wouldn't apply to the people that are in the Windsor Castle. It'll only be to the people that are in the little shack. What applies tonight is my question is where did you build your castle? And what attributes about that castle are benefiting you? And perhaps are some of those benefits or qualities of the castle that you might think are saving you perhaps to your own detriment. So let's look into some of those things. The first couple slides are going to be pretty routine for all. A lot of us have been doing wise man and foolish man for 60 years now. So we'll talk about the wise man who built his house upon the rock. As Colby so eloquently read for us, all the verses I'm reading tonight are going to come from the New American Standard 1995 translation. But Matthew chapter 7 and 24 says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and slammed against the house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. In modern American English, you might think about these words like, well, this guy, he listened to what Jesus said. He took advantage of those cautions that Jesus left in his parables. He built his Christian structure, we'll call it, whether that's a shack or a castle, in a place that was solid. and in a fashion and a manner that makes him feel cozy and warm and safe. And that's what we're wanting here is solitude. Solitude's maybe not the right word. That means by yourself, but solidity in your structure. Everything's affirmed and you're not worried about what's going to happen to the structure because you've got it planted in the right place and where Jesus said to. And when you think about the way that we're geared as human beings, I talk about Abraham Maslow a lot because one of my dissertations was on him in college. But I mean, you just look at people as a whole. The very first thing that you need in life is to feel warm, safe, and cozy. You need to have a place that you can plant yourself and you can feel okay. And if you don't, all the other things aren't going to follow. Self-actualization is the top of Abraham Maslow's pyramid here. And that means being the best possible person you can be, achieving those high peaks that nobody thought was possible. All the advancements that we make in our lives, whether it's as far as the world goes and it's somebody like Mozart or Albert Einstein, or whether it's just you being the best family member you can be, you can't be that if you don't have that structure to go back to. If you don't have a place in your life, whether it's physically, most important physically, but also emotionally, to go back to, then you can't reach the best that you can be. Again, with Picasso and Mozart, if those guys are finishing the piece of their career, Mozart's about to finish his biggest composition. He did leave one empty, but let's pick whichever one you like. He's about to finish the most important piece of his career, and then he finds out his house is on fire. He's going to put that down and go put out the fire. The house is a little more important. So the rock, literally and figuratively speaking in this sense, is what's most important in your life. You have to have that air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing to fall back on. Otherwise, you're not going to reach your full potential. So we keep reading. We talk about this house on the sand. That's probably giving you guys a little bit of anxiety. Matthew 7:26 says, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and slammed against that house and it fell, and great was its fall. And I said the word anxiety, right? Let's do a thought exercise. I say the word anxiety, what pops in your head? Everybody's probably got a picture right now. If you're afraid of heights, it's something like that. Standing in a position like that, that's precarious and something's about to explode or fall or burn, or a baby's going to get hurt or something like that. That this is a place you don't want to be. Somebody who's looking at that is wanting to scream at that guy and say, back up, get out of the way, because you're not warm and safe and cozy. You don't have those baseline attributes that we talked about. You don't need, you need a lot. You can't be that best person you want to be because you're not in the place that you should be. You're in a precarious place, whether it's emotionally speaking or physically speaking, like this guy, because we all know a strong breeze would be the end of the day for this guy. That's it. So not really bringing up anything new here. This should be routine for a lot of us. But have you ever wondered that let's talk about somebody who comes forward, for example. So if it's a place of guilt and of active repentance when somebody comes forward because of something specifically they did wrong, a lot of times you'll see really solemn attributes and looks and feelings, or even tears and just humility, and kind of beat down to your skeleton, to your core. And is that from shame? Potentially, that could be a big piece of it. But think about another person who came forward because my baby's in the hospital and I'm sick. I remember standing up here the first week Henry was in the hospital, and I was telling everybody what was going on. It wasn't fun. I didn't stand up here. I just as easily could have gone forward, but instead I stood up and made an announcement. But the feeling wasn't cozy, safe, and comfortable and warm. It's the opposite of all those things, the lack of all those things. And so we'll take shame aside from it. Why do those places that are not cozy, not safe, not warm, especially emotionally speaking in our Christianity, why are they so sad? And that's, again, not because of shame, not because of repentance, but it's distress. You're in distress. You're in the wrong place. And again, bringing this back to a psychological standpoint, your completeness as a person is not where it should be. You are not headed in a direction that's going to allow you to be self-actualized. You are not going to grow and be into the person you could be because you're actively in distress. So you need to do something to get yourself out of it. Now, whether that's coming forward and just asking for prayers or physically moving yourself someplace else on the planet, but you got to actively do something to get out of distress. Matthew chapter 11 and 28 says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. I'll read a couple parallels, but the idea here is you're either in a place where you're actively in the shield and on the rock of Jesus, and you're safe, warm, and cozy, or you're somewhere else and you're not safe, warm, and cozy. Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 9 says something similar. 4:9 says, so there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter rest so that no one will fall through following the same example of disobedience. And an Old Testament example in Psalms chapter 4 in verse 8 says, in peace I will both lie down and sleep, for you alone, O Lord, make me to dwell in safety. So hammering it back home, again, everything I've said so far has been relatively redundant for most of us. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The rock is Jesus. If you're not built on the rock, then you're not going to have all the cozy, fluffy, comfortable feelings that are on Abraham Maslow's pyramid. You're going to have all the ones that aren't, and none of those are good. They all feel really bad. So let's keep talking about the house on the rock, and pretty soon I think I'll make it make sense here to where we're going with the sermon. This is a picture of the Castle of Edinburgh. Jake and Cody and I got to see this a couple years ago. This castle was built around 1000 AD, sometime in the 11th century. So it's been around for about 1,000 years now. So this is a castle that stood the test of time. It's literally built on a rock. All that black stuff beneath it is limestone, I think they said it was. The colors of all the rocks have changed because of the Industrial Revolution. Everything's stained black in Edinburgh. So it's really pretty, but it's also really dirty. So that's kind of neat. But here's a good example of a house built on a rock that's stood the test of time. This doesn't do it any justice, actually. This picture is taken from a little village square that's down around with pubs and shops and restaurants and things like that. And you're actually looking way up at it right now. It's so big that it's far away and you can't get the perspective. But this looks like it's like half a mile away, but it's only from here to across Main Street. But it's up about 8 floors. And on the bottom right corner of this picture, there's Jake and I did some math right before the sermon here. There's seven floors worth of stairs that you have to climb up, and then you get to the front gate of the castle. You climb up 3 more, and then you're inside the castle, and you climb up 5 more to get to the original castle where it was built. The original castle is up there where the Union Jack is, up in the center. The point of this castle was to be impenetrable. And that's why it stood the test of time. It's been around for 1,000 years. So if you're thinking about where you're going to build your little structure, if it starts out as a little tiny shack and you're trying to build it into a house and up into a castle, are you going to want to build it up on top of this big solid rock hill where people can't get to you? It's impenetrable, and it's going to stand the test of time. It's going to stand for a long time. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 13, if you care to read along. Most of what I'm reading tonight's Matthew. If you want to stay in Matthew, that's where almost all the verses are going to be. Matthew chapter 5 and 13 says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. 14 says, you are the light of the world, a city set on a hill that cannot be hidden. Nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but in a lampstand, and it gives light to all that are in the house. For let your light so shine before men in such a way they may see your good works and glorify the Father who is in heaven. Okay, so there's one example of a house that was built on a rock. This next slide, I'm going to show you another house that's built on a rock. Not that last one was literal. This one's kind of figurative. And this is going to be the crux of my sermon here. This is going to kind of bring you into where I'm really trying to go with this. When I Googled house built on a rock, this is the picture that popped up. Some kind of AI Pinterest, Facebooky looking picture. It's got the quote down at the bottom, Matthew chapter 7. And there's this, obviously a farmhouse built on top of a little butte, that kind of tiny little single rock structure. Then it's up there by itself with a tree on it. It's clearly not real. But this is the standard image that pops in people's head. Build my house on a rock. And like I said, when I Googled it, this is the first one that popped up. So I'm not the only one that thinks this way. But there's kind of a pattern here. So the last house on a rock I showed you was this big fortress that's, large in stature, and it's withstood for thousands of years. And it's not unachievable, but it was kind of hard to get to. And then I show you this next one. Well, now we've got this single family unit on top of this small little rock hoisted way up in the air where nobody can reach it. And the last point I made was kind of reinforce this, right? You got to have the light, the lighthouse up on top of the hill that shines for all to see. But if we keep going with this same mentality, all of a sudden we're going to be the only last little people on our one tiny rock, and nobody can ever get up. And not only can nobody ever get up to our one little tiny rock, but no new ideas or no questions can ever hit us. If we build ourselves and hoist ourselves way up on top of this rock to where nobody can even question our ideas or our mentalities or our Christianity to its core, then how do we know if the pillars that our Christianity is built on is going to even stand, if it's going to even, if it even means anything? If you hoist yourself up so high to where nobody can reach you, and you never give anybody an opportunity to test you, how do you know your faith even means anything? And that's written a little more eloquently than I just said in James chapter 1. James chapter 1, most of you could probably quote it. Starting in verse 2 says, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let the endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives to all generously and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But if he must ask in faith without any doubting, for the one who doubts in the surf of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For the man ought not to expect what he will receive from the Lord, being a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways." Okay, so this is my lesson for tonight, and this is geared toward West Main, and I appreciate the attendance. There's a lot more people going to hear this than I thought. In modern English, we might say this another way of James saying, be happy when your faith is tested, because you know that testing of your faith is going to cause and promote endurance. If you don't have endurance, you can't do anything. If anybody's ever tried to walk on a treadmill, you figure out what endurance is real fast. Whenever you feel like you can't walk anymore, that's what endurance is. Okay, and you build your endurance when you walk further than you walked last time you walked. That's endurance. In verse 4, we'll read this literally. It says, "And let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing." Let's try that again in modern English. Meaning, if you don't have endurance, and we just found out that endurance comes from your faith being tested. So if your faith is never tested and you don't have endurance, you are incomplete. James says that literally. You are incomplete. You are not a whole Christian. If you build yourself up on top of this rock and just hold on to what you know to be true and know the fact of the faith that XYZ preacher told me this, and I know it to be true, and I've been reading I got this King James Bible when I was baptized. I've been holding on to the literal same Bible for 60 years. I've been going to church. I've missed Sunday, Wednesday, Sunday night Bible study, gospel meeting, and I get in my own little zone here, and I just dug in. I just stay in. Nobody can shake me because I'm not going to let them. I just dug myself in this hole, and then I just hoisted myself way up into the sky so nobody can reach me. You are still incomplete because your faith is not being tested. Luke chapter 18 and verse 9. Luke chapter 18 and verse 9 says, "Also he spoke this parable to some who trusted themselves and they were righteous and despised others." Starting verse 10. "Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, 'God, I thank you that I'm not like the other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess.' And the tax collector, standing afar off, would not so much as raise his eyes to heaven, but he beat his breast, saying, 'God, be merciful to me, a sinner.' I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." Now, the second part's a little off from where I'm going to go with this. But the sentiment rings true, even if it's not from a haughty perspective, as this one clearly is. Can you get into heaven if you're incomplete? Everybody shake your head this way. If you can't, then none of us stand a chance. We're not going to get there. None of us is ever going to be complete and perfect. That was Jesus. There was only one guy. However, it's obviously our duty to strive to get there. And would you rather be on Judgment Day pleading your case as the Pharisee or the tax collector? You could stand there as the Pharisee and say all the things I said. I've got my King James Bible that I've had for 60 years. I've gone to every single service, never missed. I built my house up high. Nobody's shaken me. I'm as faithful today as I was 95 years ago when I got baptized. Here's my ticket. Option number one. Option number two. Okay, God, I know I messed up a lot. There's a lot of things I could have, would have, and should have done differently, and I wish I could do them over again, but I can't. Here's what I have for you. I'm a sinner. I don't deserve to go to heaven, but wherever I could and whenever I could, I think I did my best to spread your word. There were lots of conversations that could have and should have gone differently, and I did not win those people over for you. I wish I could have, but I didn't, and then that's on me because I didn't have the right words. I didn't say them in the right timing or right order. But I did my best to shine your light by pushing it out into the world. Any opportunity that was appropriate and that presented itself, I did my best to push your light into the world rather than hold it up and guard it and protect it and bury it like the parable of the talents, for example. You tell me which one of those two arguments you'd like to present on Judgment Day. And if you don't think Judgment Day will be a court case, you should read that over again. Moving on. It's going to come to a conclusion here pretty soon. This is Lindisfarne. Lindisfarne was a monastery is the word I'm looking for. It's on the northern coast of England, not terribly far from Edinburgh, ironically. And if you look it up on the internet, they describe it as the center of Celtic Christianity. So this one, ironically, hits the answer right on the head. This was a castle built on top of the rock that was designed quite literally to study God's word, and promote Christianity. Kind of, it seems a little too appropriate. But this place is famous not for that, but for being the site of the very first Viking invasion on the Isles of Great Britain. So this was the first place to go down, and that's what it's famous for. So these guys, unfortunately, built their house on a rock that was backed into a corner, and they were doing the right thing. They were headed in the right direction. They quite literally had their nose down and they were studying the scriptures, which fits our example here, but they didn't expect the unexpected. So that's option number three I have there. And that was the shortest of the three. So let me sum those all back up. I didn't make it clear that I was listing these into three different options, but in hindsight, hopefully you can see that I am now. So to line these up, to wrap the sermon here and hopefully make it mean something for you, you've got three different options for building your house on a rock. Jesus said, build your house on the rock and not on the sand. All three of these houses are built on the rock. And just because it's built on the rock doesn't necessarily mean it's built in the right place. So be careful when you're building your city on a hill, whether it's a city or castle or house, or you're just starting and it's a little tiny shack. Be careful where you plant yourself, because you might build yourself straight up, right up on top of the butte, like the very first example shows there. You're safe. Nobody's going to get you, but at the same rate, you're incomplete, like James said, because your faith is never going to be tested, and you've isolated yourself into what you know to be true, whether it was or wasn't. You knew it to be true. You've wrapped yourself in that like a cocoon. There you are. There's your castle. Number two, you might build yourself into a pretty decent functioning city. We'll use West Main as an example here. Maybe we've got the best church that West Main could possibly be. If we hoist it way up on top of a hill and make it impervious like these castles were, so that no one could get in, that's why they stood for thousands of years, because they were impenetrable. If we build a church or your own personal little castle or your house on a rock that's impervious, it's going to be great, but it's quite literally going to die out, because the only people that are going to get a benefit from it are the ones that are inside. So be careful about making your house on a rock so great that no one can approach it or no one can be let in, because quite literally it'll just die off. And then lastly, be careful not to build yourself out on the corner somewhere where everything's going great. You're doing what you think you should be doing, but you don't prepare for the unexpected. Because if you don't prepare for the unexpected will show up. When the Vikings showed up to Lindisfarne, they might as well have been aliens. Those people didn't know that Vikings existed. Some people come across the water and they started killing them, just like the Philistines did to the Israelites. So if you don't prepare yourself for what's going to come will come. You'll either be ready for it or you won't. To read the verse we've read 3 or 4 times over once more, Matthew chapter 7:24 says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them may be compared to a wise man who's built his house on the rock, and the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and slammed against that house, and yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on a rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against the house, and it fell, and it was a great fall. Most of us here were born into the church. Uh, and the point I really want to drive home here, I'm going to say literally. I'm not going to shroud it in any kind of analogy. What I want us to be cautioned by is what you built your house on. I want you to build it on because you're able to compose this idea from what you literally read from Jesus's words. Not because you heard Connie Adams, Ken Frazier, Pat Gamp, or Jamie Helmick or Zach Leach stand up here and say, this is what we should do. It's a great idea, and here's why it's a great idea. And it might be. And I laid it out all nicely, and you can read it, and you can take it and build it up, and you're going to build your house on that little idea cocoon, whatever we talked about, and it just grows and grows and grows until you've got a castle built on top of that idea. Do not build your house on that rock. Build your house on the rock from the ideas that you can pull out of what Jesus said, whether from his parables or from his example or what he did. Because the rock that stands is going to be the one that Jesus planted, not the one that all those guys that I mentioned. Now, learning something from someone else is not a bad thing. That's why we have sermons. That's why we have Bible studies. You can't, and again, that gets back to the house that's built on top of the butte. You can't just be in your own little echo chamber. And I'm as guilty as any. I stand up here and I quote people all the time. I got the idea from this sermon from Jamie Hines, so I used to worship with in Florida, or Jamie Helmick, or the guys I listen to on the radio, Andrew Clavin, Jordan Peterson. I'm as guilty as any, okay? My point is, don't focus on what has been enshrined by this guy, this guy, this guy, this guy. Build your house on what has been enlightened to you out of the Bible. Build your house on Jesus, not on tradition, not on the way it's always been, not on what my dad said to do. Your dad, not Darren. You get it. Build your house on the rock. Matthew 11:28 says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. If you've not been baptized and donated your life to Jesus, designated your life back to God, and made the steps that you need to, you've not even started building your little castle or your little shack yet. So all this has kind of been all for naught. So obviously, that's the first step. You need to be baptized. I can't say anything more than that. It's laid out time and time again in the New Testament. The way to heaven is through Jesus. And the only way to start building your house on the rock of Jesus is through baptism. If you feel like your house is built in the wrong spot, believe it or not, you can pick it up, move it, put it somewhere else. It's not too late to do that. It's not as heavy as the Castle of Edinburgh. If you need prayers to help you pick your house up and move it, please let us do that for you. If you've not been baptized, we'll help you start building your house tonight. If you have need for either one, please take the front pew while we stand and sing.